Welcome to Disasters Maybe, a podcast about disasters in contemporary fiction. I'm Jordi Serrano Muñoz, and in this show, I talk with scholars and writers about what it means to invoke catastrophes, to interpret our present and our future. There's many different ways to talk and imagine adaptation to the climate crisis. Technological fixes, a return to previous traditional, more sustainable practices, a reduction and simplification of our plotted, sometimes excessive ways of living a modern life. Most of these ideas of adaptation, however, rely on a sense of what is normal, what is to be considered standard, typical, conventional. That also includes a sense of the conventional in neurological ways, which tends to obscure what is already different in how to relate to the world that is already existing, and how to see, how to explain, taste, smell, and make sense of things. Australian novelist Rose Michael explores in her latest novel, Else, what it means to approach questions of environmental adaptation and neurodivergence in very creative, experimental, and fascinating ways. This story follows a mother and her daughter as they traverse a devastated strip of land near Melbourne, searching for refuge, but discovering in their journey a new way to communicate with the land and with its non-human inhabitants. A way to express this fascination that has to do with how the daughter, Else, sees the world, and which Michael expresses in her story with plenty of creative, formal ways. We talk about all of this and some more in our conversation. Enjoy. Rose Michael is a novelist, a critic, and an academic based in Melbourne, in Australia. She is a senior lecturer in writing and publishing at RMIT University and the author of 3 novels. Her debut, The Asking Game, published in 2007, was a runner-up for the Vogel Award and received an Aurealis honorable mention. Her second book, The Art of Navigation, published in 2017, had an early extract shortlisted for a Conjure Award and published in the Review of Australian Fiction. Her fiction and criticism have appeared in Island, in Griffith Review, Engine, Best Australian Stories, The Conversation, and the Sydney Review of Books. We will be talking today about her most recent novel, which was published in late 2025 by Spineless Wonders. Else is set in a very near future on the Mornington Peninsula south of Melbourne, or as its characters call it, the Ninge. Extreme floods have made the city uninhabitable, and Liesl flees with her 13-year-old neurodivergent daughter, Else, to a derelict family home off the grid. As they move deeper into a narrowing strip of land between rising waters and approaching fires, the novel follows this double journey. So one across a landscape that is being reclaimed by the weather, and another through the interior life of a woman trying to find her way towards a sense of hope. So in this novel, the disaster doesn't necessarily end the world so much as it strips away the conditions under which a wrong kind of life had become normal. And to me, that reconfiguration, it is very attractive, and I hope that we will discuss how deliberate it was with her author. So, Rose, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jordi.
So, to me, it was very interesting while reading the novel to see that in Else, the climate catastrophe that you describe doesn't necessarily arrive as this single catastrophic event, and it doesn't put the characters in this sense of immediate danger. So the floods push the protagonist out of the city, but what follows is perhaps less an emergency and more this slow reconfiguration of their life. This transformation of the landscapes that they follow, their ways of communicating, and also of thinking what skills matter and what kind of knowledge is important to survive. So, as a craft, as from your point of view as the author, how deliberate was for you that design? Was this something that you had in mind from the beginning? What made you want to measure the effects of disaster by putting the focus on slow transformation instead of just like the simple destruction of the asteroid hitting the land?
It's such a good question because the first thing I knew about this novel was the climate crisis. I went into it. I'm a speculative fiction author. I've done cloning. I've done time travel, climate crisis. But actually, as I started writing, really quite unconsciously, I was writing about parenting a neurodivergent child, which is also my lived experience. And what I see now, what your question reveals to me, is that this is the slow creep crisis, the parenting that is very close to normal and perhaps normative as sort of socially acceptable, and yet diverges. And this feeling that there isn't a moment, there isn't a car crash. It's just more sort of missed milestones, a sort of moments of kind of estrangement, and it's very difficult to see the point where something that's your normal, it's your new normal, is actually really off grid. To sort of use that language that you said. So I think to the question of intention, it was really informed by what I saw in my immediate surrounds of the climate crisis. So my opening scenes were really, the creek where I run, just sort of looking at the deluge, at the flash floods, and thinking, this isn't the global warming I signed up for. Melbourne was going to be warm. What's with these sort of catastrophic floods? And I think we haven't had a massive event. There's not a cyclone. There's not an earthquake, but our environment is being seismically shifted. And I guess I'm thinking of things like which may be an apocryphal kind of urban myth about the frog in the jar that doesn't realize the water is boiling because it's increased so gradually. I don't know whether that's true or not. But I guess one of the things I would say as a writer is I don't know what's coming as I'm writing. As a literary writer, you're sort of following the words and having that journey yourself. And one of the things that I was actually pushing myself to is they can't stay in a limbo. Like, that's not my kind of writing. That's hard to write where nothing happens and you're just in a kind of modernist interior, and that's not what I'm doing. So that movement had to kind of come from somewhere. So there is an increasing impact from the environment. And there is a catastrophic event in the middle of the book. And there are other environmental impacts apart from flood. There becomes fire. So there is this sort of increase. But yeah, I don't know that it was a conscious choice. It was more that motivation. In a way, it sort of becomes background and maybe a bit metaphoric. So there's a guy, I got quite obsessed with this 1970s article by a Californian surf lifesaver who studied videos of people drowning and wrote, and it has pictures, and it's called The Instinctive Drowning Response. And he analysed what the human body does as it's drowning, and it's not aquatic distress. It's not flailing arms and screaming. The body actually goes quite still, and the arms stretch out on the surface of the water, and the body sinks below the water, and every time it bobs back up, all it can do is take a breath. So it can't yell. It knows not to agitate. It's really trying to spread itself on the surface of the water, and sometimes there's a kind of a spiral or a kind of ladder. And I was quite obsessed by this idea that the instinctive response doesn't look like trauma. It doesn't look like crisis.
It's a great metaphor, and as you say, I'm trying not to spoil many things about the book in that way. There are some echoes and some references. I really like the way that you put that slight comparison between the slow creep of the catastrophe and processes of parenting, and this idea also of how to connect rhythms, basically, and how to pace yourself when you're trying to meet some milestones and sometimes missing them, and how to actually trying to establish these two processes that can go at different rhythms, that is the more personal and the more global, trying to see how they can enter in some kind of harmony, and how crises tend to have, of course, these moments of spikes, but usually are very flat. And in this flatness, it's very difficult to create momentum, at least in fiction, right? And I think this is something that was very interesting to me when I was reading your novel. This sense of dread, but very much contained. I saw that in an interview that you gave to Harley Dark during the production of the novel, and it's very interesting because you just said that you are a writer of speculative fiction too, and that tends to be conflated with dystopian fiction, which it's not necessarily the same, right? But in this novel, by writing this novel, you realize that your goal was to write more hopefully, or at least towards hope. And at the same time, well, you have the protagonist that is constantly anxious and very paranoid, and is very this total disaster planner. And then you see that at least the first half of the novel is seen through the eyes of this adult protagonist as it travels, and you're carrying the same anxieties that she does. And perhaps there's this moment of shift towards a more hopeful understanding of what is going to be the outcome. And I wanted to know, through your own perspective as you were writing it, how did the hope enter into into your messaging, or into your agenda, or into your character?
Yeah. That was very conscious. And I actually remember having a conversation with someone, and I was like, well, that just can't go in. So I sort of had this line where I said, sometimes you, as an author, you have to kind of control it. And the line I said was that I had to just put on my big girl pants and just decide. And I do think Tony Birch, a beautiful Australian writer, I was listening to a talk he gave once, and he said that his writing is wish fulfillment. And he's like, all the abandoned children and battered wives find each other, and the bad guys get their comeuppance. And I sort of thought, well, I mean, after I heard him, it wasn't my intention at the time, but I thought there is a kind of wish fulfillment here. My child is not like Else. Else is an attempt to imagine another way of being, that if the surrounding circumstance that says she's not okay, if that circumstance goes, we would actually see that she was okay. So it was really sort of like, well, if you're considered dysfunctional in a school environment, what if there's no school environment? If it's considered that you don't know the social norms, well, what if you're talking to animals and birds? What are the things that you could say? What if you don't have to do that? What if you don't have to tell the time? Telling the time being sort of a social construct that a lot of, autistic kids really struggle with. Where I'm like, actually, what if you were just getting up when it was light and going to bed when it was dark? Like, no one has a problem with that. And so that was sort of, I guess, the idea of hope was also personal, to kind of imagine this, as well as it being a panacea against the climate's gone to shit, I'll just give up. It was sort of like, where is the potential opportunity? And I was just thinking of, so there's a lot of scientific research in the book, which all of my books, I kind of totally nerd out on or geek out on the research, as any good academic does. But particularly whenever I sort of get a bit of a writing block, or not writer's block, but, when you're really sort of in the literary sort of craft construction of it, it's such a delight to break away and go and speak to someone on the board of Zoos Victoria about, blue-ringed octopuses or spider crabs or whatever. And I sort of set myself this task where I would do just the research on whatever animals I was observing, whatever I was interested in. And I would, every single time, I would find a way of seeing that as a hopeful story. So, for example, one of the things that blew my tiny mind was that they've caught on video fireys, as in firefighters in far north, who are often helicoptered into big bushfires or grass fires, have caught on camera birds starting the fires, picking up burning twigs to start a fresh blaze, because it flushes out all their little prey out of the undergrowth. So you actually have firefighters putting out a blaze, and you have a bird. And so, like, looking at stories like that and going, well, okay, so that's not very hopeful for humans. But so sort of just trying to find that science and find a different way of looking at it. And so the question that you're talking about is sort of the book is in two parts. And again, that was something where I was like, I want to write against binaries, and I want to do it through binaries. So it had to have a before and after. It had to have Lisa and then Else. And one of the reasons that it had to have Else was I couldn't make Liesl hopeful. And in a way, the way of then making that hopeful, I just kept thinking, like, when I was pregnant, I mean, I'm so old, it's years ago. When you're pregnant, there's all this attention. The medical professional all is like, oh, what's your blood pressure? How size is what this and blah, blah, blah. And it's like the second the baby comes out, it's like no one looks at you again. And you're going, hey, that was really full on. And I sort of had this joke with my partner, discard the host. And so in the book, I was like, well, I'm thinking of it like a hermit crab that gets rid of the old house. And there was sort of a point where I was like, Liesl can set it up. She can see the debilitating constraints in this world, but she can't live without, she can't want to live without them. She doesn't have that capacity. So the point of view kind of had to shift and to realize that sort of mission. So in a way, one of those characters is potentially an unreliable narrator, like maybe Liesel's anxiety and paranoia is like just her problem. And I guess the other strand is, you're incredibly accurate, or just the synthesis, the summary that you gave is so apt. And you talk about this external journey down the niche. So she has the geographical journey down the niche, and then she has the interiority of her letting go. So like a hermit crab. And they go and they, like hermit crabs, they get rid of the shell and then they go and try plastic cups and just try and see what's going to fit next and hopefully get something beautiful. But there's a third journey as well, which is the family backstory. And so the backstory, my thinking is that it's in the landscape and that it bubbles up and it just shifts point of view. But my feeling is that Else and Liesel, that they, to greater and different degrees, they receive these hauntings, they commune with these spirits, or they receive these stories kind of come to them. And so I think that's the sort of third strand, which is, the more experimental, the more sort of time travel-y, and layering out. And that came out of my, I guess, as a research question, the inquiry I was embarked upon is, how would this behaviour be received in a different environment, by different people? And so on the one hand, I'm really trying to imagine a world which is catastrophic and has very little of this world in it, of a world where Else would succeed, would have advantages, evolutionary advantages. And then on the other hand, I'm also going, well, how would someone like this present in the 1970s? How would someone like this present 100 years ago? What might have been the advantages or the accommodations or the tolerances in a different world, or a different era?
Thinking that maybe a disaster scenario, catastrophic scenario, allows you to at least present that, because any disaster or catastrophe, especially when we consider them as these striking events, ruptures a sense of normalcy. So something comes in and completely upends the way that we used to see things. And that at least allows you to have from the exterior the conditions to justify a new way of thinking and approaching things. But one thing that I found that very interesting about your novel is that you go 2 or 3 steps further than that. So it's not just that there's been these catastrophic conditions that are pushing the characters to having to think on their feet and having to reimagine things. Is that this is the focus of action and thinking also shifts to Else in that case. So at the beginning we see things from the normative point of view through this, basically, but the progressive shifting to actually understanding and seeing how adaptation can go beyond just a normative adaptation, actually to embracing that kind of diversity is very powerful, and it's also very effective. You as reader go together with that in that journey, and you are invited to actually get into that. And one of the ways in which you do it, and I wanted to talk to you about that, it's in terms of form, because I think it's one of the most striking features that you get to see when you're as a reader, when you face the book, because you take a lot of very interesting formal choices, a lot of breathing space, many line breaks, many columns. It is a strange book to read in that sense. It is an experimental book, and there's this way in which you represent Else's speech patterns, this echolalia, which is this sometimes involuntary repetition of words and phrases. There's a lot of wordplay, vocal stems, and how that is cannibalizing the narration in a good sense. And to the point in which the prose sounds more like Else's, basically. So you're basically in Else's mind. How it was for you to let that idiom capture the form of the novel at that level? I mean, and also, is there something about disaster, this stripping away of the social world, that made that formal crossover possible for you?
Yeah, so one thing I was thinking when you were talking before about the affordances of the disaster idea is I was just thinking, how often have you seen an environmental crisis and there is a conversation as though it sent people back in time, like you don't have houses, you don't have running water, you're stuck in a cave. And at the same time, it's kind of futuristic, like you've landed on Mars, you don't have any resources. So I sort of think there's something that fascinates me there where you're not in the now without stuff, you're actually in the future and the past, right? So it's sort of that idea that I guess time itself, that social construct, is erupted, and when we've had the catastrophic bushfires here, the sky turns dark at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with ash, and the ups and downs, all those sort of parameters are sort of thrown out. I guess the thing about the language or the poetic play on the page, I mean, the one thing I'd say is there's been a heap of reviews, lots of really good reviews, a couple of not good reviews, but every single review has talked about the poetic play. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a poet. I'm not a poet. And I was like, I'm not sure I knew how out there that was. And I guess the reason I'm sort of saying that is in that conversation, I'm trying to show that Liesl is not that different from Else. She's just managed to pass or mask her sort of wordy, nerdy, whatever has been accepted because she's in this kind of editorial, kind of academic, whereas Else has just pushed it that little bit further. She's not into the reading and writing. It's just in the speech, and that's not okay, whereas I was writing ridiculous ode novels when I was 10, and that's gold star. But if you're walking around the playground and you're talking to yourself like that, that's not acceptable. And I guess I would say it's a big part of the pleasure for me. It's proven like far more out there than I realised, which makes me think about the normative novel and the constraints of the novel and what's socially acceptable in terms of the novel. Because there's some pretty weird Tristram Shandy, there's some wild novels out there, but now we've sort of got these constraints of sort of realist, whatever. But the other thing I think is that if you actually were to record conversations that people have, not such an articulate and semi-scripted one as this, but you overhear a bunch of high school girls on the tram, it makes no sense. People are repeating each other, they're talking over each other. The second they understand what you're saying, they stop their sentence. And so one of the things I was sort of trying to do was to capture what I think is the real realism, whereas realism is this literary genre which bears no relation to my reality. And I sort of instead was thinking far more in a sort of train spotting kind of way. This is actually how people talk, right? People, stand there and give you these kind of, I don't know, monologues about coffee or something when you're asking where the toothbrush is or something. Very at cross purposes, right? And I think that this is revealed to you if you are neurodivergent or you're in an environment with neurodivergent, and I think particularly autistic people, because they're saying, what's going on here? This is mad. And you're going, actually, it kind of is. And there are lines in there which are, from that experience. But also I did spend 6 months in an Aboriginal community in far north Queensland years ago. And there was a line in there that really struck with me where one of the local women I was working with, she said to me, why do you fellas always say something back? And I was really struck by this idea that, I think I'm being nice. I think this is a conversation that if you say it's a nice day, I say, yeah. And she's like, just the stuff you say back is useless, is meaningless. And I just thought we've got this totally different idea of an exchange. And in that community, we were always told eye contact was really quite aggressive. And so many of those constraints are things that you might experience with a neurodivergent child receiving eye contact the same way, thinking, why are you giving me these words? There's no information in them. So the poetic play was not as conscious a literary device as sort of everyone seems to think. Everybody's talked about the alliteration and the pun as though it's just art. But for me, it was very much about both neurodivergence, but also about how weird we are socially in terms of talking, and that the text has the possibility of trying to capture that. It can be far baggier.
Have you read Lara Jean McKay's The Animals in That Country?
Yes.
There's also a lot of use of lyrics and strange word formations precisely as a reflection, I guess, on communication and the limits of communication and what we consider to be normative communication and how to actually decipher.
And one of the things, because I talked to Laura Jean about that, and one of the things she talked about was sort of writing semi-poetry and then putting it through Google Translate into one language, into another language and back. And I think that sort of filtering is very true to the experience where your neurological wiring or social or cultural or whatever sort of aspect of your identity doesn't exactly marry up with other people. And there's this sort of constant, negotiation and translation, and that idea that maybe you succeed in some kind of transaction, but maybe it's to one side of what you're actually talking about. maybe the two things that maybe language is almost like a metaphor.
Yeah, I think I wanted to ask you like a last question that maybe connects precisely with that last experience or one of the experience that you were saying, because it's the sense of place of the novel. So sometimes we tend to think that some environmental novels or some environmental narratives can happen anywhere, but at the same time they are infused with this sense of where they are actually taking place. In else, it is very clear there is this very explicit journey through this very specific strip of land, let's say, and there's also this sense of belonging and of feeling at home in the niche. And I wanted to ask you, what is basically your relationship with this idea? There's this very rich tradition of especially settled writing, no, in and about country, but also these ideas about what it means to actually think of the end of the world, where for some peoples the world has already ended to an extent. So what does it mean for you to write climate disaster specifically from and about Australia? And what do you think that writing from that context adds or complicates about environmental writing elsewhere?
Look, I think it's my first response was to say it's fraught. Our occupation is fraught. We are the beneficiaries of violence and dispossession. And I think it's quite challenging to avoid the kind of myth making of a disaster, dystopic Australia, to write that and to not tap into kind of cultural myths of like an empty landscape or those sorts of falsehoods that sort of came with invasion. And I guess, but then on the other hand, particularly in this context of sort of an own voices movement, I don't feel like I can also write presence or characters that I don't have that experience of. In a way, it's a line that one is navigating, and I think it's work we have to do. That's the point of navigating the line, and those pressures are real, and there's no answer, and I misstep as much as anyone else, and that's sort of the process. And I think that one of the things I was really wrestling with, but it was never my intention and I never saw it for 5 years or something, was so where I came from in the start of writing the book was I was like, well, the first book was set in the desert and the second book was set in the forest, so this one's going to be set in the beach. So I've always written from the landscape. I'm definitely someone who's, always kind of putting my experience of the country in there. And we have a beach house down at a shack down on the Mornington Peninsula, where I've been for 30 years or something. So we spend a lot of time down there on that sort of rugged ocean back beach that faces off Bass Strait and Tasmania. So I'm very, very familiar with that area. But one of the things that is a mystery to me is, what can that place be to me? Because I'm an English immigrant. And so on the one level, like what I nearly said then was, I'm not even Australian. But actually we're all, all of us white Australians, or, all of us are immigrants, who are not Aboriginal or Indigenous First Nations people. And so in a way that makes my position the sort of universal position. So that kind of gives me like a place to start from. And I think that where I really thought about it was in these scenes where they are working with the real materiality of the landscape, when they've got the shells on the beach, when they're sort of in the middens, the bones, trees that have been exposed, stones, and to try to write that matter in a way that gave it gravitas, respect, character. Like it's not a background. And I'm really happy with sort of the idea that the white humans escaping flood from the city are interlopers. And actually the animals, there is this sort of shift in perspective. They can leave, they can go. And that can also be a hopeful sort of way of looking at it. I'm aware that as we have this conversation, I've sort of slowed down and I can see myself thinking. And I guess what I would say is that this was a concern of mine with the book. I was constantly like, what right do I have to write here in this way? Like, why don't I, set it in an alleyway bar in Melbourne? And I think that it's always when you feel sort of slightly uncomfortable and you're asking a really genuine question that you're trying to solve through your writing, that actually that's what creative practice research is, right? Like, and then what happens is that feeds into the book, and the book becomes the story of what is their relationship and what right do they have. And so that's where the sort of the backstory, I try to sort of go, well, what does it matter where they came from or what their story is or how long they've been there or what they've done or turned a blind eye to. And that's sort of how I tried to, I guess, point to the lacuna in the narrative, show that I knew what was not told and what has been covered over or left unsaid.
It's not about really like trying to like solve that issue. It's maybe like it's the
Mm.
invitation of staying with the trouble. This idea also of trying to make it productive precisely by not turning landscape and the non-human into something that is ancillary and optional and just like a
Mm.
tool for the human characters to progress, but they actually become enmeshed in the story. They are characters, they are protagonists in an effort to create more horizontality. And that is in itself, I guess, a way to not to undo or to like question the historical legacy of colonialism and
Mm.
settler colonialism, but actually trying to project and imagine a different way of redefining the relationship with country in that sense. It is, at least that's my impression, what I got from the book, that it is a very honest approach to that sense, because it departs from that idea of there's not going to be hierarchies here. Everything and everybody belongs in that place because they are questioning their relationships with that same place. And that's maybe just the
Yeah.
very basis of what
Yeah.
we.
And the idea, I guess, is that, I like the idea that you're creating a canvas, an imaginative space. And the disaster in that sense has cleared away the weeds where you can see what's actually growing.
Mm.
And that becomes a place of possibility for I can imagine other relationships occupying that space. Like there's room for that kind of attentive listening or that sort of possibility being taken up.
Of hope at the end. Thank you, Rose. It has been great. I really, really enjoyed the conversation.